Trillikan Chatterjee from NHS Digital. Do you want to raise your hand? Great, thanks. Trilly is a product lead at NHS Digital who has product managed for several teams making government digital services better for the public. Gill Conquest, social anthropologist. Gill is a social anthropologist who has spent the last 4 years working to provide appropriate technical solutions to help non-literate hunter-gatherers in the Congo Basin to map and protect their most important rainforest resources. Tracy Miranda. She's co-founder of Quechua Coders. Did I say that correctly? Tracy is a software developer and founder of Quechua Coders, a software consultancy specializing in Eclipse tools for scientific and embedded software. And Meri Williams, who is CTO of Moo. Meri is a geek, a manager, and a manager of geeks. She's CTO at Moo and also manages her own micro consultancy, Chrome Rose, which helps digital and technical teams be brilliant. So, welcome to you all. So that thing I mentioned earlier about, not that one, about asking questions. So here we go. Okay, so, oh yeah, okay. So the first question.
Just the worst possible place
this is
to
a,
do it, right?
this is a, yeah, no, I'll read them out, I promise.
Okay.
The first question, do you think it's ethical to encourage members of underrepresented groups in tech to join the industry where they face microaggressions and systematic oppression? So, I think that's a really good question, but I really, really, really want to focus on implicit bias in the products that we build rather than the industry, because we have the opportunity to do that right now. So I'm not gonna ask the panel that question. The next question: what's the hashtag? So, well, actually, no. So, what I'd really, one thing I'd like for this evening to live on is to come up with a kind of crowdsourced hashtag that encapsulate the feeling of exclusion when you come up against tech that doesn't suit you, or the feeling of tech where it says tech for all. So like that's sort of the opposite of it. But what I'd like to do is I'd like everybody to use their Slido app and come up with hashtags that you think are worth using now and as you move through the world and come up against things like Alexa. Okay, so that's that one. So let's get started. Okay, so I think examples are really interesting. So I guess I'd like to go down the row and have everybody talk about what the most egregious or the most shocking or their favorite example of bias embedded in technology is.
Yeah, hello everyone. I'll go with probably the most recent one. And it was funny, Sarah had a picture of Alexa on the screen. And we got an Alexa at home just at New Year, and I've got 2 kids. So I've got my son who's 7 and a daughter who's 5. And so they spent the whole New Year's Day sort of giving Alexa commands. And the commands mostly consisted of asking for Alexa to play the same song over and over and over again. But anyway, my son would be there and he would be like, Alexa, play Dance, Dance, Dance by Justin Timberlake. And he wouldn't even get the name right, but Alexa would play it. And then my daughter would go and she'd be like, Alexa, play Dance, Dance, Dance by Justin Timberlake. And Alexa would go, I don't know what that is. Like, she would suggest a different song. And then my son would instantly go, she doesn't like you. So he had already, just within that little interaction, sort of picked up on the fact that my daughter wasn't being understood. He was, and he sort of concluded that somehow that meant he was better, or that he was more understood, or he had a knack for it. And I don't know, as a mother, but at the same time as someone who understands tech, I was kind of quick to jump on that and say, well, no, that's not the case. But then you think, okay, well, this is going out, and already from that young age, they're starting to have, just unconscious things and biases formed in their mind. So, yeah, I think a really, really important topic.
So I work with forest people in the Congo Basin. There's a lot of hype about how technology is, now everywhere in the world and everyone's using mobile phones. The forest hunter-gatherers I work with have never used mobile phones. There's no phone network, so there'd be no point. They don't have any money in order to pay for the phone network or to buy a mobile. And one of the most, we really have to take it back to first principles. One of the most difficult things that I found to explain is on and off. Because if you live in a rainforest, you don't ever have anything that you have to turn on and off. And there's several different levels of on and off with a smartphone, because it's smartphones that we normally use. There's pressing the button to turn the screen on and off, or there's pressing the button for a long time to turn the whole mobile phone on and off. Obviously the symbolism is very abstract, but also that concept of, having something that is sometimes working and sometimes not working for whatever reason is very difficult to get across. We've tried using sort of equivalences, so alive and dead, but that's a bit morbid, so we sort of moved away from that one. Open and closed is something that we've tried and has been a bit more successful. So, but mostly with the screen, then it's just a button press, so you open the screen, you close the screen again. For me, sort of the biases in technology are sort of like right there at the start of the process of using it, which I think is very interesting. It's a problem that we're always working on solving.
So I want to say two things, actually, that I really appreciate what you said, but I think there are two things there that I would slightly disagree with, which is that I think there are an awful lot of people around the world that are yet to come online, and that we are kidding ourselves if we think that problem is solved. There are places with such poor internet or even no connection, like you've just said, that we've got a lot of work to do to bring the rest of the world online, and to do that in perhaps a different or more appropriate way than the kind of way that the internet has spread for us and been so commercialised. But I also think that bias isn't something that is something that lots of people want to improve, because I think the metrics for products sometimes tend to be around making something faster, cheaper, and that those metrics actually take over whether something is how easy to use it is, or how trusted or accountable that could be. So I think that bias should be brought forward. I think it's too critical to be left as once the product is shipped. That's kind of too late. So that's how I feel about that. And I'm going to move on, because I think I gave quite a few things that have my biases that are at the forefront of my mind.
So I guess I have a little bit of a different view on this, not really working in a commercial context. But I do think that bias is something that's kind of encoded by the organisations that develop technology and the way they're thinking. So I think in a lot of things that we develop, there's a bias towards the organisation's way of thinking, whether it's a way of thinking about its problems, whether it's its way of conceiving the people that it delivers services for. And I think that in kind of trying to resolve that, things like research and being representative in the way that you go out to people are really important. But it's also kind of being able to kind of tackle the organisation's implicit way of thinking. In terms of kind of examples, so when we thought about working on the Check Your State Pension Service, there was a lot of bias within the organisation toward what it thought people needed from the service, which was what it had provided, what it provided in terms of information. And actually what people's concerns weren't, what my pension entitlement is now. Most people were worried about the future. But it was, for many people, just too big a technological challenge and too difficult kind of a switch in mindset to actually take that on. And it was only when we really challenged the organisation on that we were able to give people what they needed. So I think when it comes to like any kind of technological project, you know, you need to first think really hard about the organisation, what values, what culture it represents, and what it doesn't when it comes to like the people that it serves.
I suppose the example that annoys me the most is how shit we are at getting even the basics of this right. Who's filled in a form recently that only had male and female as options? A, male and female is sex, not gender. Gender is not binary anyway, right? Thank you, Charlotte. We are terrible at... I joined an employer within the last 2 years where I literally could not correctly answer any of the demographic questions that I was asked. I'm married to a woman, but there was there was not a civil partnership option at a time when I technically was still in a civil partnership. Didn't have an option that represented my ethnicity because I'm white but not European, and a few other examples as well. And so I was literally like, it's day one, and I think I've already lied to the HR system, or I can't fill it in. That's a little like, this is not rocket science, right? We should be better at just even those very basic things. I know recently it's both great that they fixed it now, but the fact that like even Spotify, who are great at this, only just made it so that you've got more options in terms of describing your gender, because their advertisers wanted to be able to split it that way. So just we can't even get those really, really basic things right, let alone when we use machine learning to encode decision-making algorithms which depend on data that's wildly biased. So there's been a whole bunch of examples of having algorithms learn based on a data set which is inherently biased. So if you take a load of previous mortgage lending decisions in the US and you train an algorithm on them, the algorithm is racist. The algorithm does not grant mortgages to people who are not white because bank managers in the US traditionally have not granted those mortgages, and that is just, it's like money laundering for bias. It's just hiding it in the AI and I'm from an AI background, so I feel very passionately about making that stuff better, because we think computers are rational and logical, and so we lie to ourselves about it being better because it being a rational and logical and unemotional decision because the computer made it. But we train those algorithms and we teach those things based on things that are inherently biased. I can pass this one. Yeah.
So those are all really, really good examples. I'm wondering at what point there could have been an intervention so that the biases that ended up being encoded in those products wouldn't be there. What's the role of the people who's making those choices? Would it require a systemic change, an organizational change, a change in the metrics, as you were talking about what success is? And I'm going to say whoever wants to jump in.
Right. So I know we don't want. I take your point that we don't want to make this all about how do we make teams more diverse, but the reason that more diverse teams outperform other teams isn't because it's easier, it's because it's harder, right? It's because having those conversations makes us make better things, and I think that is one way to do that. The first time you work with somebody who is from a culture where first name, last name is not how names work, you never fuck that up on a form again, right? The first time somebody sits you down and goes, my pronoun is not she, her, or he, him, I prefer they, or I prefer hen, which is the non-binary term in Swedish, for instance. You get better at it. And so I think one thing we can do is be better places for more diverse teams, because that set of perspectives makes us build better things because we're more aware.
So one of the ways that we tried to counteract bias was actually changing the hardware that we were using in the first place. We started out using smartphones with an application which used hierarchically organized decision trees in order for people to make choices about what kind of resource they were trying to map. But we quickly found that people found the categorization structure and the fact that if you pressed on an icon it would just move between the screens very sort of difficult conceptually to understand. And it was really difficult to to draw icons that would represent a category. So I tried to draw a tree to represent a tree category, which underneath it would have sacred trees, fruit trees and things. And every time I showed the picture to people, people were like, oh, what kind of tree is that? Is it a sapelli tree? Is it a mahogany tree? I was like, no, it's just a tree. And they were like, well, there's no such thing as just a tree. Because, you know, all trees are used for something. So there's always some reason for it. So we did away with the whole category structure altogether. We did away with the touch screen interface because that also causes problems, especially if people have calluses on their fingers, which forest hunter-gatherers usually do because they're always doing sort of, you know, things with their hands, climbing trees and hunting animals and making rope and stuff. So we created a system of cards with NFC chips embedded that you could tap against the smartphone in order to take a GPS point and map a resource. And people loved it. The success rate of being able to use the application shot up because there was no sort of hierarchical structure to it. The cards were just there, and you could say what kind of resource is this, and people could just pick up the card and tap it against the device. So, I mean, just going back to the design space in the first place and thinking, okay, hang on, we've got this huge problem, like, you know, let's rethink the whole idea of what it is we're trying to do. Eventually sort of worked out really well for us.
So to the extent that these problems are systemic, they need systemic solutions, and sometimes the only way to get systemic solutions is to prove your case to the people who influence. So I think it's about taking real tangible examples about how these things are affecting people and putting them in front of people who can make those things change. Again, I mean, I could go back to an example, but it's not really about bias. But I think in one example, there was a ministerial change that was going to be made to one of our services that we knew was going to be really quite bad for users. And the only way we could change that minister's mind was by putting user research videos in front of them or saying, look, this is not going to work. And I think it's only when you bring that immediacy to those people that they will feel even remotely compelled to change things. I think that that's just something that's like built into the hierarchy of organizations in some way. People, like fewer people being at the top and them only having so much time to think about things. So you have to get that evidence in front of them and say this is an important thing and it needs to change.
Yeah, I'll do one more. So one of my favorite stories, it comes from, there's a TED talk, and I think it's called The Myth of Average. And it basically talks about how in the 1950s, there were these brand new fighter jets in the US Air Force, but they were finding that the pilots were actually sort of worse off flying them. So their reaction times were getting worse. And first they blamed the jets, then they blamed the pilots, and then they tried to blame the people who were teaching the pilots to fly. But eventually what it turned out to be was it sort of came down to the cockpit. And the whole fact of, how could the pilot use the cockpit to, just make those split-second decisions. And so what had happened was the designers of the airplane had decided that they were going to design it for the average. And then someone came along and he sort of measured all the pilots, and he measured them on 10 different dimensions, everything from height to where their shoulders were, to how long their legs were, to how long their reach was. And then he sort of said, well, how many of the pilots are going to match the average if you take all the stats into consideration? And so the number was 0, right? So the cockpit had been designed for nobody. It worked for nobody. And so the lesson from there, and then the plane designers weren't keen to fix that. They were like, oh, that's going to be really expensive. That's going to be impossible. But the US Air Force pushed to have it done. And the whole concept was not to design for this average, which is a myth and doesn't work for anyone, but design for the edges. And as a result, that led to the technology which you have in cars today, where you can kind of adjust the seat, you can pull it forward, you can pull it back, you can adjust your steering wheel. So I think that idea of design for the edges rather for this mythical average, which just means you're designing for nobody.
Thank you. So that relates very well to the first question on the list up there, which is, should we make more versions of the same products so they're more suited to more types of people, celebrating our differences, or make better one-size-fits-all?
Yeah, there's no one-size-fits-all.
I mean, I think making adaptable technology is actually a better solution. So making a thing that you can then modify and change in order for it to be more suitable for different kinds of people. So that, I mean, the original application that we created, you could put different pictures into it. And so we worked with different sort of user groups all around the Congo Basin. And some of them wanted different things. So we could just change them. And that made it sort of more tailored to this very specific local context that we were working in. So I think, I mean, adaptable technological solutions is the way to go.
I would say from my open source background, I would agree, like systems that you can take and adjust and change for yourself. I think there's something still in that, though, that the people who mostly contribute to open source projects tend to be white young men who have more time than anyone else to be able to put to those projects. So there's other problems that come from that as a style of working. So it's like it's not just about, because I've worked on projects that have been hugely adaptable, I think there's also ways of, kind of to what Meri was saying about ways of working that encourage a more diverse group of people to contribute to the thing that you're doing. But that is hard.
It's kind of a mirror with that issue and the whole kind of training data set issue. If the data set is predominantly based on like some the kind of average that doesn't necessarily exist, or doesn't necessarily represent everybody, how do you change the data set, or how do you rebalance the data set in that way?
How do you do that?
Like, first we find it, then we fix it, right? That one of the most distressing pieces of research I saw last year was one that said there'd been a negative effect of people becoming more aware of unconscious bias, because when people were aware that everybody was unconsciously biased, they went, oh, I'm just like everybody else, it's fine. And then actually discrimination got worse. And so we have to, every time we talk about this, go, you need to become more aware, and then you need to actively fix it. You need to become more aware, you need to actively fix it. Because if we just accept that it's part of the human condition to have shortcuts in our brains, which is basically what bias is, then if we're not actively working to be aware and to do something about it, then it's really difficult. That's a very generic answer, but I think the specifics that you do are about making sure your user research is representative, making sure that you're thinking about people with disabilities as well as people who are able-bodied, that disabilities includes things that are not visible, and it's daunting, right? If you're designing for a really diverse group, it means you've got to gather more information and develop more understanding, but you then build better things.
I was going to add to that to say that I think, and this is slightly tangential, so I say it and I don't go back to you, but that so many of the things that we make in software are about this kind of digital solipsism, which is like just about you in a place and your individual experience, whether that's like a notification popping up or adding an image to Instagram. I know I'm using obvious examples there, but it is all about like you in a place and your experience. And that's really a lot of what we've built and a lot of popular technologies that have come from Silicon Valley. And considering what has just happened in the world and will continue to happen for at least 4 years, if not more, this is something I'm thinking a lot about, is what about technologies that meet community needs? Like technologies that bring people closer together, that help to alleviate some of the division that we now see across our communities. Can't we optimize for that?
Okay, so then there's a question that was given to me by the panel before, which is sort of related, and I'm going to wind it all together. What ways have you found that makes people think about the perspective they make their products from? And that's actually super related to people living kind of in their own, Facebook fake news bubble. And how do you engage people to see the world in a different place and have empathy with somebody who has a different perspective or ability or gender or any number of other things.
Do you want to go with your...
Not an easy question.
Yep.
I think you start by talking about it. I think we all, on some level, respond to stories about different people who go through similar things. And I think that the worst thing we can do is kind of like treat the problem as something that is, so hard to solve that we don't really kind of talk about it. Like, we've got to talk about it more actively, got to talk about it more frequently, and that's the way in which kind of empathy kind of permeates.
When I was part of the team building GovUK, my favourite thing, which I'm sure many of you have seen a photo of, was somebody took a flip chart, piece of paper, cut a hole out the middle of it, wrote users and stuck it on the window with an arrow. It was just like, everybody out there is a user, and that's true for GovUK. But remember, you're not your user, and you've got to go find them and talk to them to understand them. And I use that. I know that term is a very digital service kind of term, but we're building things for people. We have to go find ways to connect with who they are and what their problems are and what their daily experiences are. If you've never done user research and seen somebody who's wildly different than you, you're doing it wrong.
I should just say that photo has become pretty famous in government, by the way.
I'm going to go back to an audience question. What are the examples of implicit bias in software development? In particular, what can you do as an engineer to be aware of these biases?
I'll do a quick one, which is maybe not inherent bias, but I work in open source, and everyone wants to fix things for Linux, and only for Linux. How many people use Linux here? How many people use Windows? Yeah, so I think it's pretty typical of the open source communities, and the reality is like 70% of the people will be using Windows, including client, but because the developers are all using Linux, it's just harder to get things fixed for that. So it's a bit of a weird one, I know, but there you go.
Like all the usual accessibility, like install a screen reader and try using a website if you're working on it. Spend a day a week using your product on a 3-year-old phone with 2G only activated on it, and then tell me about your performance, how wonderfully optimized your site is for speed. I grew up in Africa. When I go home, I have opinions about people's work. Even Google, I have opinions about, man. Like, how can it's got like one search box and a picture? How can it be this terrible? But yeah, do the things that make your other people's experience closer to yours, and that Laura Hogan did a great talk about Etsy doing this, where they had a device library not full of new phones. They had a device library full of old phones, and set a router up in your office so that it, like many of us have this anyway, a router that craps out every 3 minutes. Like, you want to understand the frustration of being in Thailand trying to use something over the internet that doesn't cope well when a connection craps out? Do that. Like, make your reality less privileged, and it helps. And those are small things, and you're right. These are systemic problems that need systemic answers, but as an individual, what things you can do is just try and get your experience closer to something that's much more realistic for the rest of the world.
Yeah, I think I'd have to agree with that. I remember a particularly distinct memory in my head is when I was in the field with our software developers, because I work in a multidisciplinary team, and we'd done some mapping. We wanted to get the data onto the computer so that we could show the guy who was meant to be dealing with the data how to put it into a GIS application. And then we found out that the logging company's computers only ran Windows XP, which was invented before smartphones, so it didn't recognize anything that was on the smartphone. And you come across that kind of problem in the Congo Basin all the time, because everything's out of date, the infrastructure is terrible, the phone networks are unreliable, there's always the chance of the government's kind of trying to listen to what it is that you're sending over the phone networks, and then it's going to cut you off. So yeah, trying to imagine like the worst possible case scenario situation and put yourself in it from even just an infrastructural point of view is really important.
I agree with all of that. I also think, though, that we probably need some new tools to be able to see this stuff, because particularly when you look at automated decision-making or really just complicated code, which is kind of some of what I know that's not entirely true, but, you know, we talk about algorithms now, all the algorithms, like it's a new meme, like this, like it's not that new. But I think there are new tools that we perhaps need to see what we're making in a different way. Whether that's tools to see bias that grows within training data, whether that be for social scientists to analyse that data and understand it, or the developers on the team to have discussions about how they can build that out. But I think we probably need new tools to test some of what we make. And I think as the applications that we are putting automated decision making across to are about kind of keeping us safe or keeping us alive, those are things we're going to have like very soon, so that as individuals or as users we're able to hold this stuff to account and see where there are biased decisions being made about us, whether that's about the price of insurance that you're being shown. Well, I mean, there's a whole bunch of examples I could rattle through, but I think that there are some tools. So as well as making software or connected products easier or more accessible to use, I think, to speak to my colleague Richard Pope's piece on software as politics, that we also need to make products and software trusted, accountable too.
So there is there's something called the Partnership on AI. Are you familiar with it? Okay, you are. Yeah. So it's some very, very large companies like Google and Apple have banded together to have a kind of oversight board to ensure that, and I take these words directly from somewhere. Ethics, societal fairness, and inclusivity. So those things are they're part of their manifest. So how do you feel about that? Do you think that's an effective way of ensuring that things are better than they would be otherwise, or does it make you scared?
Go for it.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think it does come down to this idea of, well, how do you hold an algorithm accountable? You know, and there's a lot of thinking around that, and one of the things is responsibility. Who is ultimately responsible for the algorithm? You know, we've already had many cases up to date where, you know, software has been found responsible for the death of people, but now we're talking about the Internet of Things, where we're having smart homes, smart cities, we're going to have software in everything. And so it is really important to start having structures like that in place. I don't know the details of this particular one, but I think there's about 5 things for holding algorithms accountable. It's, you know, like explainability, responsibility, fairness, auditability. So provided they are these structures that can speak to that and answer some of those questions, then in that way it would be a good thing.
I think it's important to bear in mind that artificial intelligences and algorithms also have implicit biases built into them, specifically about what knowledge is and how it's constructed. And I mean, you know, to get very anthropological now, I mean, the people that I work with, their form of knowledge is very much based around forest spirits and how singing and dancing motivates the forest spirits to bring animals from the forest to be hunted. You know, how do you explain that to an artificial intelligence that doesn't, you know, that isn't going to accept perhaps the possibility that forest spirits exist? You know, it's going to be very difficult. Whereas it would be sort of trying to sort of stamp on those people's beliefs if you didn't do that. Yeah, that's.
So there's all sorts of AI partnerships that are popping up now. I mean a lot. I've yet to see, like, I'm not sure how effective they are yet. That's not something I'm that aware of. But the particular one that you mention, I think it's a similar thing about having diverse teams, is that you need diverse organisations in these kind of partnerships, so that you need public sector bodies in that, as well as commercial companies, non-profits too. So all those groups have a seat at the table. Otherwise, you're looking at a group of companies that are funded through the same or very similar kind of VC model, right, of this information economy, which is, I would argue, a driver for a number of problems that we have with software. But also what I think that these partnerships risk is that there are so few people that are able to interrogate or understand deep learning, and that those 1% of computer scientists who do are already like employed at Facebook or Twitter or whichever other company. And so there is a need actually to train more people to be able to audit or understand this stuff. So I hope they've got some of those people in that partnership.
Holding both mics now. I don't think I think I agree with everything that everyone's said. I don't know how much more I can add, but I completely agree with what Sarah's just said about having the groups that represent. You can bring a broader representation, holding the bigger groups that are creating the products accountable. I think also because AI and AI decision making is so opaque generally, it spits out in a result and that result affects your life. I think there's something to do with how do you bring transparency, traceability and accountability to those kinds of systems, and I don't have any of the answers. I'm not really that technical, so but I do think once you have those groups given power within those kind of organizations, they can actually do something that's better for the whole, I guess.
I think part of our problem is that journalists suck at talking about AI, and so we believe it's actually more impenetrable than it is. Like, it's like once you learn to code, you're like, oh, what this computer does is completely right. Like, it's logical now, right? Because you can see the steps that it gets there. AI is not that different. Like, yes, the vagaries of the training data you've used, or if you've built a neural network, or there's different ways of getting to different problems, but it's really not as impenetrable as it's being sold as, because that looks good in movies or makes better press. And in the same, some people said that kids who don't learn to code now it's a bit like if you were taught to read but never to write. I think we're just experiencing a raising of the bar in terms of how much you need to be able to understand to work successfully with the technology that's running your life, if you're living in the first world, and raising the bar on that. I don't think our schools and our universities and our systems are ready for the level of understanding we need to have of machines and machine intelligence, but that's probably a bigger problem to solve than we're going to manage on a Thursday night. So I'll move us on to the next question.
So I think there might be a perception that coding is a kind of completely logical, unbiased activity, sort of like more like math than creative writing, and I'm wondering if that makes people assume that there isn't bias in technology. What do you think of that?
I'm sure people assume that, but they're wrong, right? Like, and it's why there's this movement now to talk less about STEM and more about STEAM, to include arts alongside. Fundamentally, these are creative pursuits, and there are the wonder and the curse of programming is that there are 79 million ways to solve the same fucking problem, right? If any of you are Perl coders, may you be ever damned to maintain your own code. But like, I think the bias problem we have tends to be through lack of understanding in schools, by teachers, by parents. And so I'm hugely supportive of some of the initiatives I see, like to enable parents to understand better in order to better support their kids, because the difference, for a long time, all of the women who I knew who were technologists, we oddly had this thing in common, that one of our parents was an engineer or somebody who was seriously technical, and through a whole bunch of discussions, just kind of came to the conclusion, like, we just weren't scared when the computer did something weird. Like we had grown up in an environment where like nothing was inexplicable and you figured out what was wrong. And I think we have to find a way to give that, for that not to be a privilege-based thing. That, you know, I happen to have an engineer in my family, and that's why I was never scared of what the computer did, I suppose. Not that it's just logical and not creative or anything like that, but just that like there's always an explanation, right? But the reaction you see from someone who has not got a great mental model of what is happening in the technology is when something unexpected happens and they do this. What did I do? Why is this thing just acted in this completely inexplicable way? And we have to figure out how. And, you know, school or education should be the great leveler. We shouldn't have to only have these opportunities because we happen to have someone who teaches us not to be frightened of these things. We should give every kid the opportunity to not be scared of tech, because it is very hard to escape a future where it's essential. And so don't just support coding in schools, support helping parents understand better so that they can help their kids with their homework if they're, you know, not working their third job. Do the after-school program stuff. Like, don't just focus on the pipeline. Focus on the support that's at the other sides.
There's almost another question there, I guess, and that's not being helpful, not answering questions, just asking more. I think
it's a very government.
Yeah, it's a really government thing to do. To the extent, so that reaction that you just talked about, that is only present when the impact or the effect is visible, right? Yeah. So when AI are making decisions and actually the impact of that decision isn't not so visible, it just kind of permeates your life in this very, very general way. I think that's where a lot of my kind of fear comes from, is that there's a lack of visibility of fundamentally what decisions are being made that result in the outcome. Whereas in some form of user interface, there is a presentation. And so that's the kind of thing, you know, when you mentioned insurance as well, it's like, yeah, okay, right, my premiums have gone up, so why? And it's like, how traceable is that? And I think that requirement is got to be something that's much more part of the culture of doing these things than it is now.
Yeah, and to speak to that, I, you know, wonder whether, this is a very contentious point, but whether if you are involved in building software, whether at some point there should be a kind of code of conduct that you sign up to, that you agree to certain standards of quality in your work. And, you know, I trained originally as an architect, not a technical architect, but as a building architect. You know, I couldn't call myself an architect before I'd gone through various different programs and exams. It's the same for being a chartered engineer as well. And all of these things have charters that you agree to, like standards that the building that I design is not going to kill someone. It's going to be, I'll be properly insured. It will be, whereas software doesn't have that, and yet has, you know, the huge life-changing implications now. So maybe we should have one of those.
Although having been involved in some of the discussions about chartering software engineering, we don't know how to measure quality well enough. That's genuinely, there's been these conversations, and as an industry, we do not know. And in some way, my wife's an architect, builds hospitals, is in Scotland right now building a mega hospital in Dumfries, and in some ways, I think architecture got to the point where they could go, if you at least understand these things, then you're at least relatively unlikely to kill loads of people. And I think it is still relatively unlikely rather than completely impossible. And we're just not mature enough as an industry to be able to measure it well enough and then to do something about it, which I think is tragic. And we're changing so fast that I'm not sure we're going to catch up, which I genuinely really worry about. Back to the... I'll shut up and come back and get back to your question.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to an audience question. How do you think we can inspire people to think about being conscious of bias in the workplace and change unconscious bias day to day?
Make it more than an e-learning package, I guess. I mean, e-learning is a contradiction in terms, is it not? Again, I mean, I'm probably going to sound a bit like a broken record, but it's talking about it. It has to be talking about it. It has to be presenting people with real examples that they can see people, you know, the impacts of unconscious bias, rather than thinking, do you know you can be unconsciously biased? Now I do. Great. Like, it's not, you know, it isn't something that you can really think of or really understand in an abstract way. It's a really tangible thing. It's about the impacts on people's lives. And so if the communication that we have about it, if the training that we have about it, if the discussion that we have about it is more rooted in real experience, then I think that that's one way we can deal with that.
Yeah, no, I'll just add to that. I think it's great that there is so much conversation out there at the moment, and we are starting to appreciate this more. But for everyone, I'll just say the best thing is just find someone who doesn't look like you, who's different, and just talk to them and, you know, seek different opinions out and embrace that, and look to participate in environments which encourage that, and, you know, push your employers, push your open source communities to foster those environments and make sure they're happening.
I think also, where it's possible, automate it, make sure that it's easy to make it hard to miss, I suppose. So the teams that end up building much more accessible things have made it part of their CI pipelines that it automatically checks for the things that are automatically checkable. Not everything is. Like, you can build something that passes some of the checklists for accessibility, which is still an inaccessible experience because it's been designed in a way that doesn't help. But there are some things that you can make sure are there. You can do automatic checks of contrast levels. You can do like never ship anything to production that doesn't have alt text on an image. Like, there are some of those basic things that you can just make it part of the system, and then stop reinventing shit, right? Like, who writes what is your gender question for the very first time without Googling that? Like, there are decent examples of how to do some of these things, and half our problem is that we start from a blank sheet of paper, like we're the first people ever to encounter a problem. A problem is either that we start, like, we have to start over from scratch and reinvent it, or that we just take the simple crappy thing that we've seen 100 times. And there's got to be something in between that, which is actually look for best practice. I think I agree with what the other folks on the panel are saying about it being worthwhile and necessary and right to put the energy into developing that empathy and doing that work. But when it's additional work for everybody, you're demanding emotional labor, and that is difficult to do consistently and repeatedly without it starting to burn the people who care out, and the other people get a free pass on never worrying about that stuff and never caring about that stuff. If you make it more systemic, including automating it in your processes, it makes it more of a team burden than an individual burden, and I think as a developer that's a useful thing to do.
I have a question, which is whether, you know, when you say we'll go to Google to find that out, well, that makes me worried for one reason. And then generally the place where most people I see try and find solutions to unknown bits of code of any kind is Stack Overflow. It's where everyone gets their code. Like, I don't know anyone that hasn't used it, and I wonder whether that at some point could be addressed. Like, what are the other versions of that are needed? And then the other thing I wanted to just point to was that I do think this is about conversations in workplaces, but that can be quite scary and quite hard and quite difficult because you don't know how to put words to a thing. And so I think there is room for perhaps people to share some of those experiences, to create sort of slide decks with kind of slides at the end that maybe address some of those issues that people are having. I don't know, kind of ways that you can bring conversations about bias into the workplace without feeling like a crusader is sometimes useful.
Just to make the point, I don't mean like first result on Google. It's like fake news. You look for information and then you cross-check. So, but you're not in the same building as them anymore, right? So, and in the same way, you know, there's a joke about how do you tell the difference between a junior developer and a senior developer? Is the senior developer copy pastes into a separate environment to check how broken the code is, but rather than just putting it straight into production. Like, some of maturity for everybody is just learning not to trust the thing that you found. Like, it's like when you're a kid, you eat sweets off the floor. We all grow up and learn not to do that, right? Like, don't. Stack Overflow is sweets on the floor is basically what I'm saying, but please don't tweet that.
Okay, so we are almost out of time. So I want to stop with if there was one thing you could do, money no object, power no object, to change, to fix the problem, what would it be? You can take turns because I know you might want to think about that for a minute. All right, good.
Just words, no thought. Has everybody watched those kind of movies where people magically wake up in somebody else's body and then completely fail to live their life? I would like to do that to lawmakers everywhere. And I'm sure somebody can invent the technology for me. You said money no object. I just need like a time machine, a whole bunch of great scientists, and some time.
What would the laws be?
No, the lawmakers.
I know, right.
So I think, it's like there was a great placard up a moment ago at the end of Sarah's talk about if men could get pregnant, then birth control would be free and a holy sacrament, I think was what it said. Like if you have to experience how real these problems are, then you get a completely different perspective on it. And a lot of our problem is that we have hundreds of years of in some countries thousands of a single lens, which has informed everything in the system and in the structure, and that those systemic problems are incredibly deeply running, and we're not doing great at fixing it.
Anybody else?
Yeah, well, I guess a lot of it does come down to money and investment. So if you took that off the table, I think probably education, just getting the programs out there, and starting from young ages of having more education that is tailored for people and individual learning styles and things like that, but just focused on these issues of the biases and how to improve them and how to put the work in to not to go the simplest and quickest route just because it makes you the most money.
Long-term field work for software developers would be and by long term I mean not just a couple of weeks where you kind of follow some people around and try and understand them, but a good 6 months spent in the field genuinely trying to understand how it is that people live their lives differently and in different ways.
Go for it.
I don't know what it is, but it comprises some form of incentive for people who are not necessarily teams, but people who facilitate what teams have, people in middle and senior levels of management that acts an incentive. And I'm not going to say necessarily fear-based. It doesn't have to be based in fear, but something that gives them the impetus. And I can't really qualify it any more than that, I think.
I guess I'm finding it hard to think of the one thing, if I had lots of money right now, that I would do, apart from maybe run away to a desert island for 4 years and not be online. But I guess my one hope is that we can get through this kind of huge political uncertainty and upheaval with greater empathy for one another and not less.
I think those are pretty inspiring words to finish with. So thank you, everybody. It's been really great.